The silence was the first thing he had built. Elias Vance had constructed it as meticulously as the log walls of his cabin, fitting each quiet moment together until they formed a shelter against the world. Here, in the high, lonely country of Montana, the wind was a constant companion, but its howl was the sound of emptiness, not intrusion. It was a clean sound, one that scoured the landscape and the soul, leaving behind nothing but the hard, barren truth of existence. His days were governed by a rigid liturgy of survival. He rose before the sun, the cold floorboards a familiar shock to his bare feet. He split wood with a methodical, unhurried rhythm, each swing of the axe a punctuation mark in a long, run-on sentence of solitude. He checked his snares, hunted when necessary, and maintained his small homestead with a precision that bordered on obsession. The tools in his shed were not merely hung, but aligned. The tins of beans and flour in his pantry were not just shelved, but arranged by a logic only he understood. It was the sterile order of a man who had seen too much chaos and was now determined to keep it at bay. It was late autumn, 1878. The aspens on the lower slopes had long since shed their gold, standing like skeletal sentinels against a sky the color of lead. For 3 days, the wind had carried a new edge, a sharp, crystalline bite that spoke of a deeper cold to come. Elias knew the signs. A storm was gathering its strength in the teeth of the mountains, a blizzard that would soon descend and swallow the world in a shroud of white. He felt a grim satisfaction at the thought. Let it come. Let it bury him. Bury the silence. Bury the memories that still rose like ghosts in the gloaming. He sat at his table, running a whetstone along the blade of his hunting knife. The rhythmic shish-shish the only sound in the cabin. The room was a reflection of his soul, functional, sparse, and scrubbed clean of any warmth. A single cot, a sturdy table, 2 chairs, though one had not been used in the 5 years he'd lived here, and a stone hearth, swept clean even when cold. There were no photographs, no keepsakes, no remnants of a life lived before this one. The past was a country from which he had emigrated, and he had brought no souvenirs. But the past did not require souvenirs to make its presence known. It was in the phantom smell of carbolic acid and blood that sometimes caught him unawares. It was in the echo of screams he heard in the cry of a hawk. It was in his hands, the surgeon's hands, still steady, still knowing, which he now used only for the brutal, simple tasks of skinning a rabbit or mending a harness. He had vowed, on a field outside Gettysburg littered with the bodies of boys he had failed to save, that these hands would never again practice the art of healing. It was an art that felt like a lie, a futile gesture against the overwhelming tide of death. The first flakes of snow began to fall as dusk bled across the sky, thick and wet, clinging to the pines. The wind rose to a shriek, and soon the world outside his window dissolved into a swirling vortex of white. Elias lit a single lantern, the small flame pushing back the encroaching darkness, and began to prepare his meager supper. He moved with an economy of motion, a man who wasted nothing, not a scrap of food, not a word, not a thought on things that could not be changed. The knock on the door was so alien, so violent against the howl of the storm, that at first, he thought it was a branch torn loose and thrown against the wood. But then it came again, 3 frantic, desperate thuds that were unmistakably human. Annoyance, sharp and cold, was his first reaction. No one came to his homestead. The nearest neighbor was 10 miles down the valley, and the trail was treacherous even in good weather. Whoever was out there was a fool, and Elias had no patience for fools. He ignored it, hoping the wind would swallow the sound and the person who made it. The third time, the knocking was weaker, followed by a scraping sound, as if a body had slumped against the door. A long, shuddering silence followed, broken only by the storm's fury. He waited, his jaw tight. He told himself to let it be. His life here depended on a single, unwavering principle. The world outside his door was not his concern. He had paid his dues to humanity in blood and failure. But the ghost of the man he had once been stirred within him. The doctor, the healer, the fool who had once believed he could make a difference. Cursing under his breath, he unbarred the door. The wind tore it from his grasp, slamming it back against the cabin wall. A drift of snow swirled into the room, and with it, a shape huddled on his porch. It was a woman. Her dress was thin, soaked through and frozen stiff in places, offering no protection against the blizzard's wrath. Her face, framed by a tangle of dark, wet hair, was a mask of sheer terror. But it was her eyes that held him, wide and dark. They were not just afraid of the storm, but of something far worse. She was mute, he realized. Her lips were parted in a silent scream, but no sound emerged. And then he saw what she clutched in her arms, wrapped in a threadbare blanket. A child, a boy of perhaps 7 or 8, his face pale and still, his breathing shallow. The woman took a stumbling step toward him, a silent, desperate plea in her eyes, before her legs gave way. Elias caught her instinctively, her body shockingly light, and carried her inside, kicking the door shut against the storm. He laid her on the floor near the hearth, his movements clipped and impersonal. He was not helping, he told himself, merely dealing with an unwelcome intrusion. But when he turned to the boy, the doctor in him took over, his mind assessing with a cold, practiced eye. The child was unconscious, his skin burning with fever, and his leg, Elias's breath caught. A piece of bone, white and sharp, pierced the boy's torn trousers, a grotesque punctuation mark to the jagged, unnatural angle of the limb. A compound fracture, severe. Elias straightened up, a wave of revulsion and memory washing over him. The smell of gangrene, the sight of shattered limbs, the high, thin sound of a bone saw. He took a step back, the word "no" forming in his mind. He would not do this. He would not be that man again. He would give him shelter until the storm passed, and then they would be on their way. He could not be responsible. The woman pushed herself up, crawling toward her son. She touched the boy's fevered cheek, her expression one of such profound, animal anguish that it pierced through Elias's carefully constructed armor. Her silent gaze lifted to his, and in it, he saw not a demand, but a surrender. She had reached the end of her strength, the end of her hope. She was placing her son's life, the only thing she had left, into his hands. He looked at the boy's leg again. Without immediate and skilled intervention, infection would set in. The boy would lose the leg, and then his life. Elias knew it with a certainty that was as absolute and unforgiving as the storm outside. He stood frozen, caught in a war between his vow and his oath. The vow he had made to himself in a moment of despair, and the oath he had sworn to humanity in a moment of naive idealism. For 5 years, the vow had won every battle. But the sight of that shattered bone, the silent plea in the mother's eyes, the simple, undeniable fact that a child would die if he did nothing, it was a force stronger than memory, stronger than grief, stronger than the walls he had built around his heart. With a ragged sigh that felt like a piece of his soul tearing loose, Elias turned away from them. He crossed to the far corner of the cabin, to a large, dust-covered wooden chest that had remained unopened since the day he arrived. It was a coffin, and inside lay the man he had tried to bury. His hands hesitated for a moment over the tarnished brass latches. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he opened it. The faint, sharp scent of carbolic acid and old leather rose to meet him. Inside, nestled in worn velvet, lay his surgical tools: scalpels, forceps, probes, and saws, each instrument clean, ordered, and gleaming dully in the lantern light. They were extensions of a past he could not escape, a calling he could not renounce. He reached in, his fingers closing around the cold, familiar weight of a scalpel. The storm howled, and in the silence of the cabin, the only other sound was the shallow, ragged breathing of the dying boy. For a long moment, Elias stood with the scalpel in his hand, the world reduced to the pool of lantern light on the rough-hewn floor. Outside, the blizzard shrieked, a wild and feral sound that seemed to claw at the very logs of the cabin. Inside, a different kind of storm had taken root, a storm of memory and obligation. The boy's ragged breaths were the only other sound, shallow and quick, a metronome counting down the seconds he had left. The doctor, the man Elias had tried to kill and bury, rose from the ashes of his past. He moved with a purpose that felt both alien and deeply familiar. "The table," he said, his voice a rusty rasp. "Clear it." The woman, Isabella, looked at him, her dark eyes wide with a mixture of terror and dawning hope. She moved instantly, her motions swift and silent as she swept the tin plates and single cup from the table, wiping it down with a damp cloth from the water basin. Elias laid the boy gently on the makeshift operating table. I need hot water, as hot as you can make it, and clean cloths, if you have them. He didn't wait for an answer, turning to his own meager supplies. He found a bottle of whiskey, not for drinking, but for sterilizing. He poured some over the glinting steel of his instruments, the sharp scent cutting through the cabin's close air. Then he washed his own hands, scrubbing them with a harsh lye soap until they were raw, the ritual and echo from 1,000 other life or death procedures. When he turned back, Isabella was there, a steaming kettle in one hand, a stack of neatly torn strips from what looked like a clean petticoat in the other. She hadn't spoken, hadn't questioned. She had simply understood and obeyed. Her gaze was fixed on her son, but her attention was entirely on Elias, waiting for his next command. Hold the lantern, he instructed, his voice gaining its old, clipped authority. Steady, I need all the light I can get. She took the lantern, her hands surprisingly firm, and held it over the boy's leg. The light cast their long, dancing shadows against the cabin wall, a silent tableau of desperation and skill. For the next hour, Elias worked, the world outside and the years between falling away until only this task remained. His hands, which had grown calloused from the axe and the plow, rediscovered their old dexterity. They moved with a surgeon's grace, cleaning the wound, assessing the damage, preparing to set the shattered bone. He worked in a focused silence, the only sounds the clink of metal against a tin plate, the hiss of whiskey on hot steel, and the boy's labored breathing. Isabella stood unwavering, the lantern's beam never trembling. She was a better assistant than many of the terrified young orderlies he had commanded during the war. He glanced at her once, seeing not fear in her face, but a fierce, protective concentration. She was a sentinel, guarding the fragile flame of her son's life, and she had entrusted him to be her weapon. This will be the hardest part, he said, more to himself than to her. He took a firm grip on the boy's small leg, his fingers finding the broken ends of the tibia through the torn flesh. He pulled, a steady, powerful traction. Isabella flinched at the boy's soft moan, but she did not look away. With a final, grim movement, Elias rotated the limb. There was a sickening, wet grating sound as the bones slid back into alignment. The boy's body arched in a silent scream, and then went limp. Isabella let out a small, choked gasp, but the light in her hand remained steady. Elias worked quickly then, suturing the torn muscle and skin with a fine horsehair thread, his stitches neat and even. He fashioned a splint from pieces of a broken crate in the clean cloths, binding the leg until it was immobile. The immediate crisis was over. The bone was set, but Elias knew the real battle had just begun. He carried the boy to his own cot, the only soft surface in the cabin, and covered him with his thickest wool blanket. He felt the child's forehead. It was on fire. The infection, he said, turning to Isabella. That is the enemy now. For 3 days, the blizzard raged, sealing them inside the cabin, a tiny arc adrift in a sea of white. And for 3 days, the boy's fever raged, a fire that threatened to consume him from within. A silent, desperate routine took hold. Elias sat vigil, changing the dressings, forcing sips of willow bark tea between the boy's cracked lips, and bathing his small, hot body with snow-melted water. Isabella became the keeper of the hearth, ensuring the fire never faltered, that hot water was always ready, that a thin, nourishing broth simmered constantly on the stove. She moved through the cabin with a quiet grace, her presence a constant, soothing hum. She swept the floor, aired out the blankets, and even found a small, broken slate and a nub of chalk in a derelict corner, though she made no move to use it. She was bringing order to his chaos, a gentle, domestic touch that felt as foreign and as necessary as the return of his own forgotten skills. They barely spoke. There was no need. They communicated through the shared language of their task, a glance indicating a need for more water, a hand gesture for a fresh cloth. In the long, silent hours of the night, as they watched the boy together, Elias felt a strange and unsettling connection to this mute woman. They were two solitary souls, bound together by the fragile life suspended between them. On the second night, during the worst of the fever, the boy began to mutter in his delirium. The words were disjointed, meaningless, until one name emerged, repeated with a child's fearful insistence. Preston. No, Preston. Please. Elias looked at Isabella. At the sound of the name, she had frozen, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with a terror that seemed even greater than her fear for her son's life. Elias filed the name away. It was a key, he knew, to a lock he did not yet want to open. His only concern was the boy. On the morning of the fourth day, the storm broke. The wind died down, and a watery, pale sunlight filtered through the small, grime-caked window. The world outside was transformed, a landscape of impossible, brilliant white, the silence profound and absolute. Inside, the boy's fever broke as well. Elias had been dozing in his chair, head slumped on his chest, utterly spent. A change in the boy's breathing woke him. The ragged, shallow gasps had been replaced by a slower, deeper rhythm. Elias reached out, his hand trembling with fatigue, and touched the boy's forehead. It was cool, damp with a clean sweat. The boy's eyes fluttered open. They were a clear, intelligent gray, and for the first time, they were focused. He looked at Elias, then at his splinted leg, his expression one of confusion, not fear. A sound from the hearth made Elias turn. Isabella knelt there, her back to him, her shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. The tension, the terror, the hope she had held in check for so long, had finally broken through. Elias rose and walked to the window, turning his back to give her privacy. He pushed open the wooden shutter, and the clean, cold air flooded the stuffy cabin. The light was almost blinding, reflecting off the pristine snow. He had not truly seen the sun in days. He had not truly felt hope in years. He looked at his hands. They were stained with blood, broth, and the grime of the long vigil, but they were a doctor's hands again. He had taken a shattered limb and made it whole. He had stood at the edge of a small grave and refused to let it be filled. When he turned back, Isabella had composed herself. She had wiped her tears and was ladling broth into a cup. She brought it to the cot, her movements once again steady. She met Elias's gaze across their sleeping patient, and for the first time, a small, tentative smile touched her lips. No words were spoken, none were needed. In the quiet, sunlit cabin, surrounded by a world made new, a silent promise had been fulfilled. A life had been saved, and in the saving, something else, something long thought dead, had begun to stir. The weeks that followed the blizzard were a quiet study in convalescence. The high country began its slow, grudging thaw. Patches of bare earth appeared on the sun-facing slopes like bruises on the white landscape. The creek, long silenced by ice, began to murmur again, a tentative pulse of returning life. Inside the cabin, a similar thawing was taking place. The boy, whose name they learned was Leo, was a patient and resilient child. The long hours of stillness were a trial for a boy of 8, but he endured them with a quiet fortitude that reminded Elias of the stoic young soldiers he had treated, men who had faced their wounds with a courage that belied their years. His leg was healing cleanly, the angry redness around the sutures fading, the swelling receding. Elias checked it daily, his touch gentle but professional, and with each passing day, the fear of infection loosened its cold grip on his heart. Leo became the quiet center around which their new world turned. He was an observant boy, his gray eyes missing nothing. He watched Elias sharpen his axe, his gaze following the rhythmic swing and fall of the blade. He watched Isabella knead bread, his small face a study in concentration as she worked the dough with strong, sure hands. He was the bridge between the two guarded adults, his simple needs and unspoken trust forcing them into a fragile alliance. His curiosity began to chip away at Elias's silence. "Did you build this house?" Leo asked one afternoon, his voice still weak but clear. Elias, who was carving a piece of pine into a crude bird for the boy, looked up, surprised by the direct question. "Yes. All by yourself?" "Yes." "Why?" The simple question hung in the air. Why had he built this prison of solitude? Why had he chosen this exile? Elias looked at the boy, at the honest inquiry in his eyes, and found he could not offer a simple lie. "I needed a quiet place," he said, the words feeling inadequate. Leo seemed to accept this. He looked around the spare cabin. "It's quiet," he agreed. Isabella, who sat mending one of Leo's torn shirts, glanced up at this exchange, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. Later that day, she took the slate and the nub of chalk. Her hand hovered over the gray surface for a long moment before she began to write, her letters neat and deliberate. "Thank you for saving him." She held it up for Elias to see. He read the words, then met her gaze. "He's a strong boy," he said, deflecting the gratitude. She shook her head and wrote again, "You are a good man." Elias turned away, unnerved by the simple declaration. He was not a good man. Good men did not flee their pasts, did not build walls of silence, did not let their skills rust while the world suffered. He went outside and began to split wood with a fierce, punishing energy, the axe rising and falling, each blow a denial of the words on the slate. But the thaw continued, both outside and in. Leo's strength returned, and with it, his questions. He asked Elias about the names of the birds that visited the clearing, about the tracks he saw in the melting snow. The questions were relentless, forcing Elias to engage, to speak of the world he had tried so hard to shut out. He found himself teaching the boy, explaining the difference between the call of a chickadee and a junco, showing him how to identify the print of a deer versus that of a coyote. The role of teacher felt as strange and as natural as the role of doctor had. Isabella, too, began to communicate more. The slate became her voice. She wrote of small things at first, that they were low on flower, that she had found the first wild crocuses pushing through the snow near the creek. But one evening, as a Chinook wind rattled the windows, melting the last stubborn drifts of snow, she wrote the name that had haunted the cabin since Leo's delirium. Preston. She wrote the name and looked at Elias, her eyes dark with a story she had not yet told. He sat down at the table across from her, his posture conveying a quiet readiness to listen. Slowly, painfully, she began to write, the chalk scratching softly in the lamplight. She told him of her husband, a kind but weak man, dominated by his father, Jedediah Preston. The Prestons were powerful, owning the largest ranch in the valley, their influence extending to the law and the bank in the nearest town. When her husband died in a riding accident the year before, she had become a prisoner, her life and Leo's controlled by her cruel father-in-law. Jedediah saw Leo not as a grandson to be loved, but as an heir to be molded, a legacy to be controlled. He hurt him, she wrote, her hand trembling. He was trying to make a man of him. Leo is not a weak boy. He is gentle. Preston hates gentleness. Elias thought of the shattered bone, the fever, the boy's quiet resilience. What happened? He asked, his voice low. The hayloft, she wrote, her letters growing smaller, tighter. Preston was angry. Leo had been crying. He said Preston men do not cry. He pushed him. The simple, brutal words landed in the quiet cabin with the force of a physical blow. Elias closed his eyes, a cold rage building in his chest. He had seen the casual cruelty of powerful men on the battlefield, the way they treated their soldiers as expendable pawns. This was the same cruelty, just on a smaller, more intimate scale. I took him and ran that night, Isabella wrote, her narrative spilling out now. I have been running for 3 days. I saw the light from your cabin in the storm. She looked at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, her silent gaze asking the question she could not write. Are we safe here? Elias didn't answer immediately. He stood and walked to the door, looking out at the moonlit landscape. The world was no longer white and silent. It was a tapestry of dark earth and silvered frost, alive with the sounds of the coming spring. He had built this place to be a tomb, a final resting place for his past. But these two fugitives had brought life back into it, and with life, they had brought danger. He knew, with a sinking certainty, that men like Jedediah Preston did not give up on what they considered their property. He turned back to Isabella. For now, he said, the words of promise and a warning. For now, you are safe. The next morning, Elias took Leo outside for the first time since the storm. He carried the boy, still too weak to walk, and set him on a stump in the sun-drenched clearing. Leo blinked in the bright light, his face pale, but his eyes wide with wonder. He breathed in the scent of pine and damp earth as if it were a tonic. Isabella stood on the porch, watching them, a small, genuine smile on her face. Later that day, while Leo napped and Isabella worked inside, Elias walked to the edge of his property. The split rail fence that marked his southern boundary was in disrepair, several sections having collapsed under the weight of winter snow. He had ignored it for years. There was no one to fence out, nothing to fence in. It was a border without purpose, Now, it felt different. Now, it was a line of defense. He picked up a fallen rail, the weathered wood rough in his hands. He examined the broken post, his mind calculating the work needed to repair it. It was a big job, one he had long avoided, but as he stood there, under the vast, pale blue of the Montana sky, he felt a shift within him. He was no longer just surviving. He was protecting. He went to his shed and retrieved his post-hole digger and mallet. The tools felt good in his hands, solid and purposeful. He returned to the fence line and began to work, the rhythmic thud of the mallet a steady, defiant beat against the silence. He was mending a boundary, rebuilding a wall, not to keep the world out, but to keep his small, broken family safe within. And as he worked, the sun warm on his back, Elias Vance knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that his exile was over. The fragile peace of their convalescence was shattered a week later. It was late afternoon, the sun casting long, golden fingers through the pines, when Elias saw him. He was on the far ridge, a lone rider on a dark horse, a stark silhouette against the vast, indifferent sky. He wasn't moving, just sitting his horse, a sentinel surveying the valley below. Elias's valley. He felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. It was too far to be certain. But he knew. A Preston man. Jedediah Preston had a long reach. And he had found them. Elias did not react immediately. He continued splitting wood, his movements measured, betraying none of the sudden, cold dread that had seized him. He finished the log, stacked the pieces neatly, and wiped his brow with the back of his sleeve. Only then did he allow himself another, quicker glance. The writer was still there. He went inside the cabin. Isabella was at the table, patiently guiding Leo's hand as he practiced writing his letters on the slate. The scene was so peaceful, so achingly domestic, that for a moment, Elias felt a fierce, protective rage. This quiet sanctuary was his to defend. "Isabella," he said, his voice low. She looked up, and he saw in her eyes that she had already seen him. Her face was pale, but her expression was resolute. She had been living with this fear for so long that its arrival felt less like a shock and more like an inevitability. Leo looked from Elias to his mother, his young face clouded with confusion and a dawning fear. "What is it?" he asked. "Is someone coming?" "Just a traveler," Elias said, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. He did not want to frighten the boy, but the time for pretending was over. "Isabella," a word outside, on the porch, out of Leo's earshot. He spoke plainly. "He knows we're here." Isabella nodded, her gaze fixed on the distant rider. "What will we do?" "We won't run," Elias said, the decision forming as he spoke it. To run would be to condemn them to a life of looking over their shoulders, a life he knew all too well. And this time, he was not alone. "This is my land. He has no right here." "Rights mean little to a man like Jedediah Preston," she whispered. "Then we will have to create our own," he replied. That night, after Leo was asleep, Elias unearthed a ghost from a past he had tried to exorcise. From the very bottom of his surgical chest, wrapped in oilcloth, he retrieved an 1860 Henry repeating rifle. It was a relic of the war, a weapon he hadn't fired in over a decade. He had kept it for the same reason a man keeps a single, bitter memento from a life he'd rather forget, as a reminder. He laid it on the table, the firelight glinting on the brass receiver. Isabella stared at it, her eyes wide. It was a thing of violence, a stark and brutal intrusion into the healing space their cabin had become. "I'm not a soldier anymore," Elias said, his voice quiet but firm. "But I will not be a victim, and neither will you." He looked at her, his gaze intense. "Tomorrow, I will teach you how to use this." The lessons were a trial for them both. For Elias, the familiar weight of the rifle in his hands brought back the acrid smell of gunpowder and the metallic taste of fear. Each instruction he gave, how to load, how to aim, how to brace for the recoil, was an echo from his time teaching frightened farm boys how to kill. He saw their young, doomed faces in the grain of the rifle's stock. For Isabella, the weapon was a terrifying object. The first time he placed it in her hands, she trembled, her knuckles white. It was the antithesis of everything she was, a creator of life, a nurturer, a healer of small hurts. But as she looked from the rifle to the distant ridge where the sentinel sometimes appeared, her fear gave way to a cold, hard resolve. This was a tool, and she would learn to use it to protect her son. They practiced in a hidden hollow, far from the cabin, where the sound of the shots would be muffled by the surrounding pines. At first, her shots were wild, her shoulder bruised by the kick of the powerful rifle. She flinched every time she pulled the trigger. "Don't think of it as a weapon," Elias told her, his voice patient, though the lessons were tearing at his own carefully healed scars. "Think of it as a key. It is the key that will lock the door against him." The metaphor seemed to help. She began to control her breathing, to squeeze the trigger gently, to hold her aim steady. The shared vulnerability of the lessons, the intense focus required, forged a new and deeper connection between them. He would stand behind her, his hand guiding her arm, his voice a low murmur in her ear. They were no longer just a doctor and a patient's mother. They were partners in a desperate, unspoken pact. Leo, now able to hobble around the cabin on a crude crutch Elias had fashioned, watched these changes with a child's solemn wisdom. He knew the rider on the ridge was not a friendly traveler. He saw the rifle and understood its purpose. He did not ask questions, but his presence was a constant reminder of what they were fighting for. He insisted on helping, gathering kindling for the fire, his small, determined figure a testament to their shared purpose. He helped Isabella plant a small garden in a patch of earth near the cabin door, a defiant act of faith in a future they were no longer certain they would have. They planted beans, squash, and corn, their hands in the cool, dark soil, a silent promise to the earth that they intended to stay. 2 weeks after the first sighting, the rider came closer. He dismounted at the edge of the clearing, a clear and deliberate trespass. He was a young man with the arrogant swagger of someone who knows he is backed by power. He did not approach the cabin, but simply stood there, a clear message that their sanctuary had been breached. Elias was mending the fence, Isabella was in her garden, and Leo was sitting on the porch. At the sight of the man, Isabella froze, her hand flying to her mouth. Leo scrambled inside the cabin, his crutch thumping a frantic rhythm on the floorboards. Elias dropped his mallet and walked toward the man, his stride unhurried, his hands empty and visible at his sides. He stopped about 20 yards away. "This is private property," Elias said, his voice even. The man spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the ground. "Preston land," he corrected. "Always has been. You're just squatting on it. I have a deed filed in Helena," Elias replied calmly. The man laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Deeds can be lost. Fires happen. People disappear." He looked past Elias, his gaze lingering on the cabin door where Isabella was now standing, the Henry rifle held loosely in her hands. "The boss wants the boy," the man said. "Make it easy on yourselves. Give him up, and he might let you walk away." "The boy is under my medical care," Elias stated, his voice taking on a cold, clinical authority. "He is not to be moved." The man's eyes narrowed. "You a doctor?" "That is my concern," Elias said. "Now get off my land." For a long moment, the man stared, assessing Elias, then glanced again at the rifle in Isabella's hands. With a final, contemptuous smirk, he turned, mounted his horse, and rode away. That night, the silence in the cabin was different. It was not the comfortable quiet of healing, but the tense, waiting silence of a coming battle. "He will be back," Isabella said, her voice a whisper in the darkness. "And he will not come alone." Elias looked at her, at the rifle resting against the wall beside her, at the sleeping form of her son on the cot. He had come to these mountains seeking an end to fighting. He had sought a place where the only struggles were against the cold and the hunger. But the world, it seemed, had a long memory and an even longer reach. He had fled one war only to find himself on the front lines of another. But this time, he was not just a doctor patching up the wounded. He was a defender, and this small cabin, filled with the quiet breathing of two souls who had trusted him with their lives, was his ground to hold. They did not have to wait long. 3 days later, under a sky of brilliant, unforgiving blue, they came. Elias spotted them first, a slow-moving dust cloud on the valley floor that resolved itself into 3 riders. He had been on the roof, securing the last of the new shingles he had painstakingly split, and the elevation gave him a clear view. He felt no panic, only cold, quiet certainty. The waiting was over. He climbed down the ladder, his movements deliberate. Isabella was in the garden, her back to the road, weeding the bean shoots that had just begun to push through the soil. Leo sat on the porch steps, carefully carving a piece of softwood with Elias's dullest knife. "Isabella," Elias said, his voice calm. "Take Leo and go inside." She looked up, saw his face, and knew immediately. Her hand flew to her throat, but her eyes were steady. She rose, brushing the dirt from her apron, and said, "Leo, inside." Now, the boy looked toward the road, his small face paling as he saw the riders. He scrambled to his feet and hurried into the cabin without a word. Isabella did not follow immediately. She looked at Elias, a silent question in her eyes. "Get the rifle," he said. "Stay by the window, but do not show yourself, and do not fire unless I am down." "Do you understand?" She nodded, a flicker of fear finally breaking through her composure. Then she squeezed his arm, a quick, desperate gesture of solidarity, before disappearing into the cabin. Elias stood alone in the yard, his hands at his sides. He was not a gunslinger, not a lawman, not a soldier anymore. He was a doctor, and he would meet this threat on his own terms. He walked to the porch and stood at the top of the 3 low steps, waiting. The riders approached at a walk, their pace arrogant and unhurried. The man in the middle was Jedediah Preston. He was a bull of a man, wide-shouldered and thick-necked, his face weathered to a permanent scowl. He sat his expensive saddle as if it were a throne, his gaze sweeping over the small homestead with undisguised contempt. The men flanking him were the same type as the one who had come before, hard-faced and carrying their rifles with a casual ease that spoke of frequent use. They reined in their horses 10 yards from the porch. The silence was absolute, broken only by the buzz of a fly and the creak of saddle leather. "Vance?" Preston's voice was a low rumble, like rocks grinding together. "My man tells me you claim to be a doctor." "I am," Elias replied, his voice even. "And you claim my grandson is your patient." "He is. He's recovering from a severe compound fracture. He is not to be moved." Preston laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "He's a Preston. He's not some fragile flower. The boy comes with me. Now, he is under my medical care," Elias repeated, his voice taking on the cold, unshakable authority he had once used in operating theaters. To move him now would risk permanent injury, infection, even death. As his physician, I cannot and will not allow it. Preston's eyes narrowed. He was a man accustomed to being obeyed, to having his will be the only law. This quiet, steady defiance clearly unsettled him. "You have no authority here, Vance. This is my valley. That boy is my blood. And that cabin is my home." Elias countered. "You are trespassing." One of Preston's men shifted his rifle, a subtle, threatening movement. Elias did not flinch. His gaze remained locked on Preston. He knew that this was not a battle of weapons, but of wills. If he showed any fear, any hesitation, it would be over. "I have tried to be reasonable," Preston said, his voice dropping to a dangerous purr. "I can see you've taken a liking to the boy's mother. A man gets lonely out here, but she is not yours to keep, and the boy is certainly not. They are Preston property." The word property hung in the air, ugly and obscene. Elias felt a surge of cold fury, but he kept his voice level. "They are human beings," he said, "and they are under my protection." "Your protection?" Preston scoffed. He gestured at the small cabin, the half-mended fence, the modest plot of tilled earth. "This is your protection? One man in a shack against me?" "One doctor," Elias corrected, "who has sworn an oath to do no harm. An oath that extends to protecting his patients from those who would injure them." Preston seemed to have reached the end of his patience. He dismounted, his movements heavy and deliberate. "I am tired of this foolishness," he said, walking toward the porch. "I am taking my grandson." Elias did not move. He simply stood there, a quiet, immovable object blocking the path. He could see the window over Preston's shoulder, a dark rectangle in the log wall. He knew Isabella was there, the Henry rifle in her hands, its cold stock pressed against her shoulder. He prayed she would remember his instructions. "Step aside, Vance," Preston ordered, stopping at the foot of the steps. He was close enough now that Elias could see the network of broken veins on his cheeks, could smell the faint scent of whiskey on his breath. "No," Elias said simply. Preston's face contorted with rage. He raised a hand as if to strike, to shove Elias out of his way. And in that moment, another figure appeared in the cabin doorway. It was Isabella, She moved to stand just behind Elias's shoulder, her face pale but her eyes blazing with a fire he had never seen before. She held no weapon. Her hands were empty, clenched into small, tight fists at her sides. Preston's gaze shifted to her, his expression a mixture of fury and triumph. "There you are," he snarled. "Stop hiding behind this quack and bring me the boy. Your foolishness is at an end." He took a step up onto the porch, his hand reaching for her. Elias tensed, ready to move, to block him, to fight. But it was Isabella who acted. She took a half step forward, her chin lifted in a gesture of pure defiance. Her lips parted. For a moment, no sound came out, only a choked, rasping breath. It was the sound of a voice that had been silenced by terror, a voice that had forgotten how to form words. Elias's heart ached for her, for the agony of her effort. Then, she found it. A single word, spoken in a voice raw and hoarse from years of disuse, but a voice that rang across the silent yard with the shocking clarity of a bell. No, the word was not a plea. It was not a whisper. It was a statement, a boundary drawn, a declaration of war. Jedediah Preston stopped dead, his hand frozen in midair. He stared at her, his jaw slack with disbelief. The two men on their horses shifted, their own surprise evident. They had known her only as the silent, terrified woman who fled in the night. This person, this woman who had found her voice and turned it into a shield, was a stranger to them. Isabella held his gaze, her own unwavering. The single word seemed to have unlocked something within her. The fear was still there. Elias could see it in the slight tremor of her hands, but it was now dwarfed by a strength that seemed to radiate from her very core. She had faced down the monster of her past and had not looked away. Stunned into silence, Preston seemed at a loss. His power had always been in the fear he inspired, in the silence of his victims. Isabella's one-word defiance had stripped him of his primary weapon. He looked from her to Elias, then back again, as if seeing for the first time that they were not two separate, broken people, but a unified front. He took a step back off the porch, his face a mask of thwarted rage. He pointed a trembling finger at them. "This is not over," he hissed. "I will come back. I will come back with the law." He turned, stomped back to his horse, and mounted with a clumsy, angry movement. Without a backward glance, he spurred the animal into a gallop, his two men scrambling to follow, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. Elias stood motionless, the adrenaline slowly draining from his veins, leaving him weak and shaky. He turned to Isabella. She was leaning against the door frame, her face ashen, her body trembling with the aftershock of her own courage. He reached out and took her hand. It was ice cold. "You did it," he said, his voice filled with a quiet awe. "You found your voice." She looked up at him, and tears began to stream down her face. But they were not tears of fear or sorrow. They were tears of release, of catharsis, of a victory so profound it could not be contained. He led her to the porch swing, and she sank onto it, still trembling. He sat beside her, his presence a quiet, steady anchor in the storm of her emotions. Inside the cabin, Leo, who had witnessed everything from the window, began to clap his hands, a small, rhythmic sound of a child's pure joy. The silence had been broken, and in its place, something new and incredibly precious had begun to grow. The echo of Preston's threat hung in the air long after the dust from his horses had settled. "I will come back with the law." The words were a poison arrow, aimed at the heart of their fragile peace. The law, in a valley owned by Jedediah Preston, was just another weapon in his arsenal. But the immediate aftermath of the confrontation was not fear, but a profound and quiet transformation. Isabella's voice, once found, did not retreat again into silence. It was hesitant at first, a guest reacquainting itself with a long-abandoned house. Her words were soft, her sentences short, as if she were testing the weight and shape of each one. She spoke to Leo, her voice a low, soothing melody as she praised his drawings on the slate. She spoke to the seedlings in her garden, murmuring words of encouragement. And she spoke to Elias. "He will not give up," she said that evening as they sat on the porch, watching the stars prick the deep velvet of the sky. "I know," Elias replied. "Men like Preston see defiance not as a boundary, but as a challenge." What he said about bringing the sheriff, can he do that? Elias sighed, the weight of the world settling back onto his shoulders. He can try. He can invent a charge, kidnapping, holding you against your will. In a town where he owns the judge and the bank, a story is as good as the truth if enough people are paid to believe it. He had seen it 100 times in the war. Power, not truth, was the ultimate arbiter of justice. He had expected to see fear in her eyes, but instead, he saw a quiet, steady resolve. "We will not run again," she stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "No," he agreed, "we will not." It was then that Elias knew he had to act. He could not wait for Preston to bring the war to them. He had to reach out to find an ally in the world beyond his valley. He had one last connection to that world, a tether he had not tested in years. A man he had served with, a captain who had valued honor above politics, a friend who now held the position of a U.S. Marshal in Helena. Writing the letter was an act of faith, a desperate gamble. He wrote by lantern light, his hand moving slowly, the words feeling foreign after so many years of silence. He detailed Preston's threats, the injury to Leo, and the corrupting influence the man held over the local territory. He did not know if the letter would reach his friend, or if the man would even remember him. He entrusted it to a traveling tinker who passed through the valley once every few months, a grizzled old man with kind eyes and a reputation for discretion, giving him what little money he had to see it delivered. Then, they waited. The days that followed were suspended in a strange, tense peace. They worked, they healed, they built. Elias finished mending the fence line, the posts now standing straight and strong. Isabella's garden flourished, the green shoots a vibrant testament to her care. Leo, his leg almost fully healed, began to laugh. A sound that startled them all at first, so long had the cabin been without it. The bond between the three of them deepened, forged in the crucible of shared danger and quiet companionship. They were a family, not of blood, but of circumstance and choice. One evening, Elias found Isabella looking at his surgical chest, her expression thoughtful. "You miss it," she said softly. He knew what she meant. "I thought I hated it," he confessed. "I thought it was the source of all the ghosts. But saving Leo, it felt." He struggled for the word. "Right," she supplied. "Yes," he admitted. "It felt right." The marshal arrived a month later, not with a posse, but alone, a tall, unassuming man whose quiet authority was unmistakable. He listened to Elias's story, then to Isabella's, his gaze missing nothing. He examined Leo's now healed leg, the neat scar a testament to Elias's skill. His investigation in the nearby town was swift and thorough. He found what Elias had suspected: a web of corruption, intimidation, and fear, with Jedediah Preston at its center. There were others, it turned out, who had suffered under Preston's thumb: homesteaders who had lost their land over trumped-up debts, merchants forced into ruinous deals. But they had always been too afraid, too isolated, to speak up. The marshal's presence, the shield of federal authority, gave them courage. Jedediah Preston was not a man who went down without a fight, but he had mistaken the quiet decency of his victims for weakness. He had mistaken a doctor's vow to do no harm for an inability to stand for what was right. And he had fatally underestimated a mother's love. The end of his reign came not with a gunfight, but with the quiet, inexorable weight of the law he had so long disdained. His empire, built on fear, crumbled into dust. Summer arrived in the high country, blanketing the valley in wildflowers and the scent of warm pine. The sentinel on the ridge was gone, replaced by the peaceful wanderings of deer and elk. The world beyond the fence line was no longer a threat, but a promise. Elias had begun to ride out, a doctor once more. He visited the other homesteads in the valley, tending to the simple, honest ailments of hard-working people. He was not the ambitious surgeon he had once been, but a community healer, a man who understood that some wounds were not of the flesh. He had rediscovered his calling, not in the grand theater of war, but in the quiet, humble service to his neighbors. Isabella's voice grew stronger each day. She sang as she worked in her garden, old folk songs and lullabies, her voice weaving itself into the fabric of their lives. She was teaching Leo to read. Their heads bent together over a tattered primer Elias had found at the bottom of a chest. One warm evening, as the sun set, casting a glorious, rosy glow over the mountains, the three of them sat on the porch. Leo was showing Elias a perfectly formed bird's nest he had found. Isabella was humming, a sound of pure contentment. Elias reached out and took her hand. She turned to him, her eyes soft in the twilight. "I came here to be alone," he said, his voice quiet. "To build a fortress of silence." She smiled, a gentle, knowing smile. And now, he looked at Leo, then back at her, his heart full of a feeling he had thought long dead. "Now," he said, "I'm home." He had been wrong. The first thing he had built in this place was not silence. It was a foundation. He just hadn't known what he was building it for. Now, a family was growing here. A small, sturdy structure of 3 souls who had found each other in a storm. They were planting an apple tree tomorrow, a small sapling he had procured from a nursery in town. It was a small act, but it was an investment in the future, a promise of roots, of nourishment, of seasons to come. In the quiet of the evening, as the first stars appeared, Elias Vance knew that the echo of silence had finally been replaced by the sound of life.